Hi, so my name's Deborah Morgan and I work for the Centre for Aging and Dementia Research at Swansea University. My research focuses on loneliness and social isolation in later life. And today I'm going to talk to you about some research that I undertook as part of the Maintaining Function and Ageing study in Wales, which we could more commonly call it CFAS Wales project, because otherwise the title's a bit too long. And I looked in particular at transitions in loneliness and social isolation in later life. And I brought together some statistical data and some qualitative interviews with people who'd expressed that they were lonely in the first wave of the quantitative survey. But today I'm going to touch a little bit on the statistics, but mainly I want to talk about why people became lonely and what were some of the factors that meant they became chronically lonely. So I'm going to just begin with a definition. So what do we mean by loneliness and social isolation? So one of the definitions we use is that it's a situation experienced by the individual where there's an unpleasant or inadmissible lack of quality or quantity of certain relationships. And the quality is important as well as the quantity. And what it means effectively is that somebody can have a very small network and still experience loneliness. But they can also have a very small network and not experience loneliness. Whereas in contrast, somebody can have a very large network and we would assume that they wouldn't be lonely because they've got lots of family and friends around them, but actually they can be devastatingly lonely. And social isolation is defined as the absence of social contact. So how many people in Wales are lonely? So using one of the scales that we use, we found that in the age category 65 to 102, 24.3% were lonely. And that's quite significant. It's actually higher than some of the data coming from England. And we found that a third of people were isolated. But we broke it down because there are actually 4 patterns of loneliness and social isolation. So you can be not lonely, not isolated. Lonely, not isolated, we found 12.6% of people were in that category. People who were isolated but not lonely, about 18%. And interestingly, 11.7% were lonely and isolated. And some people we found actually could recover by themselves. And I'll touch on that in a little while. So some of the risk factors for loneliness are illustrated on the screen. But we found that people's pathways into loneliness were very complicated. Some people, it was just a single event, such as a bereavement. Others, it was cumulative factors. Sometimes it was factors from earlier in their life course, so people who were perhaps very shy or introverted, had smaller networks, and which impacted them on them in later life when their networks started to die off or move away. And we found that the risk factors for loneliness and social isolation were similar, but there were also differences. So I've highlighted them on the screen with an asterisk, so you can see things like urban and rural risk factors, lack of accessible transport and lack of local facilities, factors for social isolation, as well as disability, living alone and marital status. And as I said, people's pathways, when we interviewed them, their pathways into loneliness were very complicated. So they were sort of dominated by loss, really, in particular for loneliness. So it was the loss of a partner, and in one case it was the loss of their parent. It was later life divorce and marital breakdown. And then there were the cumulative factors. So one gentleman I met, was forced into early retirement because of a health condition. So he lost his network and his identity that he had as part of his work. And because of his health, he lost his driving licence and he became very lonely and isolated because he couldn't actually get out of his house anymore. And social isolation, we had a lot of retirement migrants that spoke about becoming lonely. And one gentleman in particular that I met, I'll call him John, he'd moved back to his hometown and his family had been fractured by a divorce after he'd moved back home. And when I went to meet him, he kept Skype open on his computer the whole time. And at the end of the interview, I asked him why, and he said he was hoping somebody'd come on and talk to him. And as I left his house, he took me into a room, and the room was full of boxes, unopened boxes. And he told me that those boxes were full of gifts for family members who'd never turned up. But he kept ordering stuff because the postman would come and he'd have someone to talk to. For him, and that was his only social contact, was the postman. And his story is not unusual. What we did find that everybody, regardless of their loneliness trajectory, experienced loneliness as what we termed a biographical disruption. And what that meant is it fractured their life course into before and after the event. And And that had a number of effects on them. So it disrupted their taken for granted assumptions and behaviours. So the quote on the slide here is a divorced male. And he said, "It came as a shock when she left. I had to rethink my whole life. This was a man who'd never cooked for himself. He had to learn new skills." It disrupted the explanatory systems people used to, in terms of their biography and their sort of self-concepts. So, I mean, this quote is from the man John I spoke to, and he said, "I'm not a person, really. I never thought I'd get into the state I am now." And when he was talking about his loneliness, he constantly compared the person he was before. He'd been a market trader, he worked on building sites, very outgoing, very chatty. And he couldn't get used to the fact that now he had nobody to talk to, and he'd lost confidence. And he'd become very, very quiet. And he constantly compared the life he had before to the one he had now. It also affected the way the resources people had to mobilise. Now, some people, their relationships, as I said, were fractured, so they lost social resources. They had no family and friends around them to help them. But others did have family and friends around, but they just were unable to draw on those resources. So this is one of the older males that I interviewed. And he had a good network around him. He'd lost his wife. Great network, family visited him regularly. But he was reliant on a friend to take him to the golf club once a week. And for him, because he couldn't reciprocate any longer, because he could no longer drive, that kind of reinforced his sense of loneliness, even though he was going out and about. He felt obligated to somebody else, so he tended not to draw on those resources more than once a week. Disability was a huge factor for many of the participants that went on to become chronically lonely. And as you can see here in this first quote, there's a woman who had lost her hearing. Her husband had died. She'd moved from a very rural village closer to a town to be closer to her son, but she didn't see him very often. Her other children had all moved away. She was hearing impaired, and she said she couldn't interact with people on a group basis. For her, that was to go to group events was not a solution that was feasible. She felt she'd be rejected because she was difficult to communicate with. She was also very shy, so that was an additional barrier for her, that to go into a group situation would have been her worst nightmare. And similarly, in the next quote, she says, "I haven't got the confidence to go out. You're isolated. You've got to rely on people." This was a woman who had been a nurse. And again, she had family around her. Her daughter was not particularly interested in her mother's loneliness because she had her own life and she was busy with her children and with her job. And her mum didn't want to sort of put on her and share her experiences. But for her, being visually impaired was a significant barrier. She had friends that would take her shopping and abandon her in shops because they forget she couldn't see her way out. And again, that kind of reinforced the loneliness she felt. And then the last one is a woman who gave up her driving licence voluntarily because of her poor health. She felt she was no longer safe to drive. But living in a rural area, she found she was no longer seeing anybody. And this quote on this side now refers to John. And when he moved back to his hometown, he moved into a rural area down in South Wales. And he realised he just couldn't get out of the house because there were steps up to his garden. There were steps to get out of the front garden and down the drive. And he said, basically, "I've imprisoned myself." So he actually moved to a town centre location and then found he still couldn't get out because of the busy roads around him. And he said, "Well, where would I go?" The people who became chronically lonely felt a sense of powerlessness. They felt the circumstances of their loneliness were something that they couldn't be overcome, and that sort of impacted on the way they coped and the strategies they used to cope with loneliness. Predominantly, they tended to focus on strategies that would distract them from loneliness, so it would be gardening, reading, solitary activities. People who felt they had some form of control over their loneliness and they could overcome it would join groups and various other social activities. And again, as I said, disability was one of those insurmountable barriers that people spoke about. As it says here in this quote, "I don't even try very hard. That's another thing. You want to try something, but I'm looking at the obstacles before I get there." It's those psychological barriers that are really difficult for people to break down. And when we're thinking about interventions, they actually might need more than a group intervention. They might need a range of interventions to build their confidence, to enable them to go back out before they can even step out of the door. They may need bereavement counselling. There are a whole raft of interventions that they're likely to need. And the impact of it, I mean, lots of people spoke about how they'd gone into a dark place. And this woman here, I'll call her June, she was a childless widow. She had no immediate family of her own. She had a niece of her husband's that lived about 100 miles away. And she spoke to her once a week. And she says here that, you know, she feels like she's out of that dark place now. But then she went on to tell me that she still talks to her husband every day, even though he's no longer there. She talks to him when she goes shopping, because she said it fills the space. And the way she described her loneliness was there was her house, and there was her very small in the corner. And she decided to get a cleaner to try and fill the space just once a week, so she'd have some company, because she would go weeks without speaking to another person. And then again, we go back to John. He says, "Thank God, I don't care if I drop dead or something. I'd be happy to go. But I'm not thinking that way at the moment." And as I said, I touched on the fact that people lose confidence. Loss of confidence can be maybe a reason people become lonely, but it can also be an outcome of loneliness. And this quote, when he says here, well, you know, why don't you, somebody said to him, "Why don't you go to a pub on a Saturday night?" And he said, "I just can't go in there. They were all in pairs and bunches. If I had somebody to go with me, then I could." So stepping into that space full of other people is a step too far for many people. And some of them turn to alcohol as a way of self-medicating their loneliness. So in the first quote, this was a man who was, I would term him a natural isolate. When he was in work, he never really communicated much with his work colleagues. It was enough that they were around him. But when he became ill and he couldn't get out of the house, it was just him. He had family, and when I asked him about his family, he said he spoke to them once a year, or if somebody had died, he'd speak to them, but other than that, he didn't. And he'd just go to the pub, and he'd just sit in the pub and drink, just to have people around him. Whereas the next quote's from a slightly older male who was drinking up to half a bottle of wine an evening. It was the only way he could go to sleep, was to self-medicate that loneliness. And then the other two quotes are people who are talking about how if they didn't have willpower, they would drink. But they were fearful of the effects if they started, that they wouldn't actually be able to stop. So what did I find out? I mean, some people will always recover from loneliness, regardless of any form of formal support or intervention. These people have the resources that they can draw on, and they know where services are, and they know how to plug themselves back in. People who are chronically lonely, disability is very often a factor, and the chronically lonely are unable to work out ways of dealing with their loneliness. And as I said, they tend to focus on solitary activities and distract themselves mentally from their loneliness, rather than actually do something to bring them into contact with other people. Chronic loneliness is associated with depression, loss of confidence, and increased alcohol consumption, as long as with other maladaptive behaviours. But to address it, and I think the key message here is a one-size approach, as Steve said, just won't work. We need personalised responses. We need to look at people's pathways into loneliness, find out how they got to where they are, to be able to help them find their way back out of it again. And I'm around all day if anybody's got any questions or anything you want to ask me. And I'm going to shamelessly plug, if you want more information, there's a TED talk that you can watch where I talk more about some of those stories. Thank you.